The NES is the first system that I really remember playing RPGs on. The two RPGs that were my first were the action RPG The Legend of Zelda and the turn-based RPG Dragon Quest, known as Dragon Warrior in the US at the time. Both of these had you exploring their worlds by traveling on foot throughout much of the game. This meant that any backtracking was usually needed to be done on foot and could take quite some time. This leads to today's moment that really stuck in my memory. It is one of those memories that isn't probably going to hit the same way for those playing the game today as it did for me when I first experienced it. The memory comes from the very influential RPG from the NES era, and that is the first Final Fantasy game. The moment I want to look at today is the finding of the airship. As I said, my early experience with RPGs in the NES era had very little in the way of options for travel. Most of the exploration had to be done on foot, which often required going through many enemies in the process. Sure, The Legend of Zelda had the whistle that could take you to completed dungeons, and Dragon Quest had the wings which teleported you back to the starting castle, but these were very limited in terms of their use. And the whistle, I know you didn't really get that until a little over halfway through Legend of Zelda, so it wasn't something you could really use a lot, particularly early on. These items were useful, but they really didn't give you a lot of control over where you were going, and that really limited how much you could do with them. The airship completely transformed travel once you found it. You wound up finding the airship around halfway through the game after restoring the earth and fire crystals. You had to raise it from the Ryukon desert using an item called the Levistone. Once you did, the airship gave you quite a lot of control over where you could go. If you wanted to travel back to earlier locations, you could. It was also, of course, essential to continuing your quest to restore the remaining crystals. The airship was just so revolutionary to me as a kid playing the game. It was a much quicker mode of transportation, and you didn't have any random encounters with enemies while using it. As I said earlier, this is definitely a memory impacted by my age and progression through early video games. Today, the airship itself has been in many of the games in the Final Fantasy series, and quick travel options are very common in many games these days. In fact, I would argue that the airship in that first Final Fantasy game would be viewed as very restrictive compared to many of the modern travel options available to us in games today. In the first Final Fantasy, you could only land the airship in grasslands. Oddly enough, the world of Final Fantasy seemed designed to make the only valid landing spots as far as possible from the new locations that you needed to go. So while you could travel to a number of places quickly and without enemies while you're on the airship, you could only land in places that seemed to be designed to make you have to fight against enemies on your way to the next main location in the story. Even so, I remember travel by airship to be a revolutionary way of travel in the early days of video games. It was just something I had never experienced before and really changed travel in the game for me. Playing through Final Fantasy with the Pixel Remaster showed me that this moment maybe doesn't hold up as well in the midst of modern games, but it can't take away the massive change that the airship introduced during the NES era. Are there any other older gamers that remember the first time they found the airship and how it changed travel for them? Is this a moment that stuck with you, or was it not a big impact for you even back then? For any newer gamers, is it a moment that hit you at all if you've played that first Final Fantasy game? As I said, I would kind of imagine that it wouldn't, but I also admit that I could very well be wrong in that. I'd love to hear your answers to any of these questions or any other comments you might have below. That's all for this entry in Memory Unlocked. I'll see you in the next video.